Hi everyone, welcome to week 15. Poppy wanted to make an appearance for our last lecture video. So hi Poppy, everybody. But today we're going to be talking about everything that's happened since our textbook ended. So between 2015 and 2025. If you do have the third edition, a lot of this is touched on in chapter 10. But I also assigned us some of the Edson chapters really just to allow us to read about other content that's going on during this era, but to really bring light to a lot of the ramifications of our history of sport class, talking about commercialization, international sport, and how that's just going to change things in these coming decades. And so I also wanted to serve this as a trigger warning for all of you as well, that during this last lecture, we are going to be talking about some contentious things that have happened in sports very recently. Things like abuse, things like violence, cheating, bribery, just again, kind of a continuation off of what we talked about last week. But again, I wanted us to be mindful of these things as we go forward in this class. So again, starting off with our general timeline, just because again, I want us to remember all the things that we've experienced these past 10 years, various presidential elections, various political shifts, various social demonstrations like BLM. We also have to acknowledge COVID, and really so many things have happened. So I want this to be a reflection of you all, just to be aware of how much has happened in the world in these decades. And really, I mean, you could argue that this could have been one of the most impactful, transformational decades that we've had in sport. And a lot of that is really due to things that have happened outside of sport. And so all this to say, things I want us to be very mindful of with these 10 years of sport is acknowledging that, again, the Aaron Hernandez conviction happened during this time. Governor Gavin Newsom signed the NIL bill, which we're going to talk about in much more detail today. The U.S. women's soccer wins their fourth World Cup gold medal. Kobe Bryant and Gianna Bryant were killed in a helicopter crash. There was communications of a European Super League. There was declaring no tournaments to be held in China amid the disappearance of Peng Shuai. Djokovic was banned from Australia due to COVID vaccine status. We're going to talk about a lot of COVID and vaccines. There was a lockout that happened. FIFA World Cup was held in Qatar, which was really contentious. World Athletics bans trans women competing in sports. We also have the Equal Pay for Team USA Act. Women's collegiate and professional basketball explodes. NIL deals really grow, and so many other things. And so again, I want us to just be aware of the things that have happened in the past 10 years. Specifically, and then we're going to talk mostly again about these themes. But like I said, the Edson chapters really is more about just you getting something to read this week if you didn't have the third edition of the text, focusing on globalization of sports, commercialization impacts of Nike, and really how new media is going to evolve in future generations. And so really getting at chapter 3, acknowledging that sport, like most businesses, is extremely globalized. This exchange of goods, money, and culture happens across various nations, especially now as the ease of international communications is so accessible. But both American athletes play sports in other countries, and athletes from other countries are very dominant in many sports, even American professional sports. And so how that is kind of interpreted now is really getting into chapter 34 of Nike's crimes. And this is really a devastating account of sports globalization with exploitation of international labor, particularly sweatshop-like conditions, child labor, poverty wages, and quasi-slave labor, as well as other various instances of workers' abuse. And so it's kind of a point of personal reflection for this is why are major sporting companies allowed to get away with this modern day slavery? What would it take for you to stop supporting an entire sporting attire brand? Will you continue to buy from Nike, Puma, or Adidas? Why or why not? And then finishing up with chapter 35 is really just getting at the growth of sports media through the internet, through streaming, video games, social networking, gambling, fantasy sites, which we'll get into more detail towards the end of our lecture today. But as again, a point of personal reflection, do you think sporting events will eventually lack a physical audience in the future with an increased amount of internet users? Or will there still always be people wanting to watch sports live? And so as kind of a continuation in that, again, we're going to talk about a lot of specific instances today, but really more more the themes about how things are evolving in these 10 years and really make informed decisions or judgments about where sport might be in the coming generations. And so one of the things that I want us to talk about are the Olympics. And so getting into the Olympics that happened in the past 10 years, Rio 2016, really kind of marred by a lot of massive renovations. It was the very first time in which a South American nation has ever hosted both an Olympics and World Cup in the same summer. And they had to do a lot of major infrastructure changes that was extremely costly for the country of Brazil. And unfortunately, a lot of these massive renovations proved to be a massive failure. Most of the stadiums that were erected or created for these intentions were left to rot away, or they were looted because they were no longer needed. And further to emphasize that 95% of the money that the Olympics does have or puts towards the events doesn't go towards the athletes, but the construction and reconstructions of the cities. And it would prove to be a massive financial failure for the country of Brazil. And unfortunately, because it was such a massive failure, not that the events were a massive failure, the Olympics were successful, the World Cup was very successful that summer, but due to the amount of infrastructure left to rot, there was a huge financial pit that Brazil unfortunately had to take most of the grunt or the pain for. That unfortunately will probably cause Brazil to never host again, and in particular, another South American country to never host a large world international events ever again. And the reason why is because it is so financially expensive to host the Olympics that now I would argue that we will never see a new city host an Olympics, that we're now going to see the creation or the continuations of repeat cities, which we're going to talk about in a later example. We also have Pyeongchang in 2018, which are the Winter Olympics, and so something that was very marked by this hosting was a lot of conversations or discourse around North and South Korean potential outbursts, right? So this was a very high time in which there was a lot of international tensions, and there's a lot of concern about whether North and South Korea could reconcile with their tensions to have these events, but it proved to be very peaceful. Both countries fielded athletes. This was also the time in which we had the Russian Olympic Committee being banned from competing under the banner of Russia due to state-sponsored doping programs. Like I said, some athletes were still able to compete under the name Olympic athletes from Russia, which Putin found to be particularly embarrassing. And so there is still a lot of political leverage happening at the Olympics during this decade. Tokyo 2021, not 2020 because of COVID-19. Even though it was postponed an entire summer, there were still a lot of COVID-19 effects. Sponsorship was greatly affected by COVID-19, but most companies stuck through their contracts because, again, a lot of these nations were endorsing Tokyo 2020 with the intent of getting that money back through, merchandising sales, commercialization efforts, endorsements, blah, blah, blah. And so a lot of companies were actually threatening to pull that money from Tokyo, in which Tokyo would then have to foot the bill if the Olympics were to come to fruition. Fortunately, most organizations stuck out through their contracts. So even though COVID-19 was threatening the financial integrity of the Olympics, that didn't really come to as much of a significant fruition as was threatened. We also found that there were a lot of COVID-19 effects really kind of marked by the lack of spectators, the lack of greater social support that these athletes had. There were some new sports that came about during these summer games: 3x3 basketball, skateboarding, sports climbing, surfing, and karate. And a lot of sports writers wrote about the biggest takeaways. So if you have this PowerPoint on Canvas, you're able to click that hyperlink of wrote, really just kind of talking about the, again, lack of families, the lack of hustle and bustle because of people weren't allowed to spectate the Olympics. But they also recognized that there was an increased amount of camaraderie and complete satisfaction with the games, that even though it was postponed, it wasn't canceled, that the athletes that had trained were able to still compete. And so people still felt that it was a very fulfilling event to have happened still. Beijing 2022, so the Winter Olympics in China. Like I said, I argue that the next coming years will be a continuation of what Beijing kind of established as being the very first city to host both Summer and Winter Olympics before. And I think that, again, this is going to be kind of commonplace because a lot of the International Olympics Committee doesn't want these countries to go bankrupt as a result of hosting the games. And so we're going to see a lot more repeat cities that have proven that they could host. And so we see that a lot more coming in the coming generations is my argument. We still find that COVID-19 was very much still in effect. The pandemic resulted in a lot of new implementations in health and safety protocols. And for the second games in a row, the games were closed to the public. Very few select events did have people that were invited at a very reduced capacity, basically just to celebrate championship events and other very high level accomplishments and competitions. There were new sports that were introduced, like big air freestyle skiing and women's monobob, but it was important for us to recognize that, again, that this is still a political sphere. And so there were a lot of human rights violations, that Beijing's hosting of the games was subject to a lot of concerns and controversies, especially those surrounding human rights violations in China, such as the Chinese government-sanctioned genocide efforts against the Uyghur people, the Muslim Chinese nationalists that were happening. It caused a lot of boycotts of the games, in which at the time President Biden actually sent a condemnation letter to the Chinese government saying that this isn't right, but it wasn't enough for them to pull their support. So for all the political, plight that happened, it wasn't enough for people to completely be brave enough to pull out. And again, a lot of that is due to they didn't want to, prevent the Olympians from achieving their Olympic desires, their Olympic goals. But it was more of a political show than actual political leverage happening as a speaking out against this genocide that was happening. Just this past summer, we had Paris 2024. Some of the things that were marked in this time was the pollution in the Seine, unfortunately caused a postponement of a lot of events like the triathlon. There were a lot of new sports that were reintroduced, like breaking and kayaking, reintroducing of surfing, skateboarding, and sports climbing. And Katie Ledecky becomes the most decorated American female Olympian with 14 medals as a result of these Paris 2024 games. We also had a time of being marked by a lot of misconduct, which shout out to the guy in the Long Beach State hat, which is, I think, really funny in this picture. But there are two main scandals that happened during this era. I'm sure there's a lot more. But things that I want us to be very mindful of are things in which these systems that have existed in place to allow these misconduct events to happen. Namely, Operation Varsity Blues, which kind of came to a head in 2019, but as we're going to talk about, happened for many years previous to this. And this was a criminal conspiracy to influence undergraduate admissions officer decisions at several top American universities, in which money, namely $25 million from 33 parents between 2011 and 2018, was used to bribe exam administrators, university officials, and athletic coaches, namely from sports like tennis, sailing, soccer, basketball, water polo, and volleyball, for application admissions for their elite athlete students. Some of these people nominated these unqualified people under the guise that they were student athletes to be admitted to these top universities. They facilitated applicants' admissions by basically fabricating the profiles highlighting their athleticism and their extreme, their high scores for test scores, their high GPAs, and some even used Photoshop to insert photograph pictures of their student's face onto other people participating in the sports that they were being admitted to these universities for. It was such a blatant disregard for the integrity of student athletics in college spaces that they acknowledged that student athletes get accepted to colleges on different merits than non-student athletes. And so some of the athletes that were accepted to these universities didn't know that this was happening, that this was actually kind of a ruse done by their parents to be accepted, that they couldn't get in on their own merits. But really utilizing this system that's been in place and definitely took advantage of that for many students to be accepted. And some universities like UCLA, USC, Stanford being some. But again, this was a very verified system that really impacted a lot of students being accepted to these institutions. We also have the cheating Houston Astros that happened in 2017, which again, there are a lot of other instances of cheating in baseball at this time, but this one was arguably the most contentious because they still were allowed to keep their World Series title from this, even though they cheated to get their way to win. And so the Houston Astros stole pitching signs that allowed them to win the 2017 World Series, where basically they had a camera in the outfield that led to a TV near the dugout, in which coaches and players would look for signs from the catcher or the pitcher and then hit a garbage can to tip batters onto oncoming off-speed or types of pitches. And so they were able to have a much better batting average. They were able to be more offensively talented because they were tipped on the types of pitches that were coming immediately before they were thrown. And so the MLB found out about this, right? But they had very mild punishments for the general manager and the manager of the Houston Astros. The MLB eventually suspended the GM Jen Lunthau and manager AJ Hinch for a year for their role in using electronic equipment to steal signs, fined the organization $5 million, and stripped them of their first and second round picks from 2020 and 2021. However, owner Jim Crane then announced that Lunthau and Hitch were both fired. So the MLB did not fire the GM or the manager, but the owner of the team did. No athletes were punished, no titles were revoked. And so I think that this is a further testament to the lack of, or just the cowardice surrounding this incident. The idea that, again, obviously the LA Dodgers lost in the World Series to the Houston Astros. So yes, this impacts me a bit more in personal bias, but I think that if this were to happen in any other sport organization, that title would have been revoked. Or if not, the athletes would have had severe implications on their ability to not only stay with their respective team, but then get traded to other teams and then thought of as these extremely talented athletes. In particular, right now we have the World Series against the Toronto Blue Jays, in which George Springer, again, is thought of as one of the best athletes for the Toronto Blue Jays, but he was on that Houston Astros team where he cheated. He didn't get any, he didn't get in trouble for it. He didn't have his titles revoked, and he's still thought of as a really good athlete, while ignoring that these things were really happening and had a system of success. Also, continuing our discussion of sexual assault, we have the Me Too movement happening in and out of the sporting space. And so Me Too movement wasn't explicitly about sports and sporting abuse, but a lot of athletes utilize the platform to talk about instances in which either they've been abused or seen abuse in the sporting space. But overall, it is a social movement really against sexual abuse and sexual harassment, where people, namely women, started to publicize their allegations of sex crimes that were committed by powerful or prominent people to them and to people that they know. The movement had been around since 2006, but really resurged in popularity with the use of a hashtag #MeToo in social media spaces, and really a lot of common sexual misconducts that happen for anywhere from churches to celebrities to students, politicians, musicians, and athletes. But in particular, we see this in the sporting space with USA Gymnastics, with namely Larry Nassar. So Larry Nassar was a former USA Gymnastics doctor. He was also at Michigan State University. He was called out #MeToo for sexually assaulting gymnasts as young as 6 years old during treatments. Rachel Denhollander was the first to call him out, but after more than 150 more women came out, Nassar was effectively sentenced to life in prison. The president of Michigan State University, Lou Ann Simon, also resigned in the wake of the scandal, but there are also other examples of sexual misconduct that happened to these very prominent athletes. WNBA star Breanna Stewart revealed that she had been a victim of sexual child abuse from ages 9 to 11. USA Swimming and USA Fencing also had their respective coaching issues. And all this to say that as kind of a silver lining that from unfortunately this very traumatic event that happened to a lot of high profile athletes, we are now requiring most, if not all, of our coaches, especially in the USA national sporting organization space, to be certified, to be trained and educated on their behaviors and their impacts and power differentials that they have with the athletes that they coach. We also see that this is a time to fight for gender equality, namely with USA Women's Soccer, the WNBA, and women coaches. And so for women's soccer, I really enjoy using them as kind of the fantastic pinnacle or really kind of the trailblazing status to really allow for greater opportunity for equality in sports, and they did so through many different ways. One of the things that really kind of marked this era is this fight for equal pay, in which they actually filed a gender discrimination lawsuit in 2019, alleging that there was institutionalized gender discrimination that was affecting their pay, travel, playing schedule, training, medical treatment, and more. Unfortunately, in 2020, a judge dismissed the case, saying that there wasn't enough evidentiary support to say that there was true gender discrimination happening, but they vowed to, appeal this decision. And so in February 2022, the United States Soccer Federation agreed to settle the lawsuit for $24 million, contingent on the U.S. team agreeing to a new collective bargaining agreement. And so 22 of that $24 million went towards the athletes themselves, as kind of, reparations for years of not getting paid the same amount as the men's team. And $2 million would contribute towards players' post-playing careers, as well as their other philanthropic efforts that most athletes have. On May 18th, 2022, the United States team agreed to a new collective bargaining agreement that would run through 2028 and would equalize compensation, bonuses, and other work conditions between the women's and men's teams, friendlies, as well as international competitions. And so this finalized the legal settlement. So essentially what they did is the United States Soccer Federation recognized that, again, we can do so much equitizing in the United States, but for international competition, people are always going to pay the men's teams more, even if they don't do as well as the women's teams, which historically they have not. And so what they do at the end of every professional season is they take all the money that the men's teams gets, all the money that the women's teams gets, put them together, and then divide them out equally. And so that's how they equalize their compensation based on these standards. Because of this actually inspired the creation of the Capito bill that basically expands this to not just the soccer team, but to all United States national teams, period, of all sports, for fencing, for swimming, for water polo. And so now, based on their political political leverage, they were able to expand this opportunity for all American athletes. So that's really cool. We also see the fight for equal treatment, namely around the 2019 World Cup. And a lot of this is really marked by the kickoff bout between the United States women's national team playing in Thailand, in which they, this was the very first game of the tournament in which they beat Thailand 13-0. After the game, some in the soccer world were very critical of Team USA, saying that they ran up the score, they celebrated too much, and initially put a target on their back. But the United States women's national team pushed back against the criticism, basically saying that men wouldn't be criticized as much for a similar performance. And they continued on in this celebratory fashion, mocking, of being very demonstrative. And so because of that, they were able to take advantage of the political leverage and the international spectacle in which they are causing. So much so that during the World Cup, Megan Rapinoe said that she would not go to the White House if the United States won the tournament, which is kind of expected, right? Usually the White House would host like a dinner, a celebratory, something would happen in which people were able to, again, be awarded for being the champions of whatever sport championship that they were a part of. But President Trump at the time responded by saying that the team should win before making such comments. The exchange really only shined a brighter light on what had been a very controversial World Cup participation in the first place, not only because the United States team was extremely good, but the fact that they were using this international platform to bring light to the fact that people didn't agree with their presidential administration. And so again, eventually the United States would win the World Cup, they would get their gold, and they have not visited the White House since. So I like using them as an example to really kind of showcase that they have been a trailblazer for so many points of equity, not just in pay, but also in treatment. And we see that very explicitly during their run in 2019. For the WNBA, they also had a fight for equal pay with their new CBA, in which the WNBA and its players union reached an 8-year collective bargaining agreement that allowed top players to earn at least $500,000 with an average salary of $130,000. It provided fully paid maternity leave, better travel conditions, and opportunities for businesses to expand. But they still need equal media compensation because, again, the WNBA doesn't receive enough money to really have equitable compensation for their athletes. That also is a result of not having proportionally the amount of money going towards the athletes. And so I like kind of using the example between Sue Bird and LeBron James, which at the time they had very similar, nearly identical accolades, but the salaries was eclipsed by LeBron James' salary. As well as winning the 2020 finals. We see that bonus pales in comparison between WNBA and the NBA. So I think that the WNBA still has a lot of work to be done. I think that a lot of issues, especially the contentious thing that happened with Brittany Griner being detained in Russia for having marijuana, wouldn't have happened if the WNBA the WNBA was paying their athletes well enough that they wouldn't feel that they needed to go play internationally. But again, I think the WNBA is making strides. One of the things that's happening right now in the WNBA is a lot of athletes wearing shirts, "Pay me what you owe me," really bringing light to the fact that the WNBA as an institution are not still paying athletes. It's still 2025, the same amount or at least proportionally what they deserve to be paid, getting at the idea that it's becoming more popularized, it's becoming extremely lucrative in terms of how much money people are willing to pay to be a part of the WNBA, like to be fans, season ticket holders. And so I think the WNBA has a lot of growth to have more. But it has made strides in being really the first professional organization for women's sports professional opportunities. In terms of women coaches, again, historically, Title IX has proved that participation has gone up, but leadership has gone down. However, that statistic is changing. In the WNBA, we have a lot of women head coaches. Cheryl Reeves has been coaching for 14 years. The NBA, we had 5 women assistant coaches active. Becky Hammon actually spent 8 years with the San Antonio Spurs before she left to be the head coach of the Las Vegas Aces, who in her first tenure was able to win the WNBA championship. For the NFL, there are a lot of examples of assistant coaches within these past few years, in which Callie Brownson actually filled in for the tight end coach in 2021, and she's now chief of staff for the Cleveland Browns. The MLB has had a lot of examples or a lot of documentations of women assistant coaches, but mostly in the minors. I do think it's important for us to at least talk about Kim Ng as the very first woman manager ever for the Miami Marlins. She is now vice president of, I believe, staff or baseball development for the Miami Marlins. But anyway, she's the highest paid vice president or highest paid woman in professional baseball, and she started as a manager. We also have the NHL that in 2020 created the National Hockey League's Coach Association Female Coach Development Program, basically a concerted program to develop hockey coaches, women hockey coaches, to then be coaches in not only the NHL, but also in the Professional Women's Hockey League as well. And so there are examples of this in which we have seen growth of women coaches, and time will tell to see if that proportionality will be representative of the athletes that they coach in the near years. All this to say that, again, we have had greater awareness of differences in how women and men are treated in the sporting space, so much so that in 2021 we had what's called the NCAA basketball disparity. That in March of 2021, Oregon University basketball player Sedona Prince took to TikTok about the massive inequality between the men's and women's weight rooms at the NCAA basketball championship tournaments. The posts that followed also highlighted differences with treatment and branding, food, swag bags, as you can see here. Again, that the not only was this the men's weight room in the top left, this was the women's weight room. It was just one rack of dumbbells. This was also the difference between the swag bag between the men's tournament and the women's tournament, as well as the food available to these athletes. And so there's a great disparity in treatment and money towards these different tournaments, even though for all intents and purposes, they are the same amount of teams that go and play for these tournaments, the same amount of, media outlets. And so an independent investigation of the reported inequalities at the tournament found that the NCAA had created a culture that, quote, prioritized Division I men's basketball over everything else in ways that create, normalize, and perpetuate gender inequities, and that the organization perpetuated a, quote, mistaken narrative that women's basketball is destined to be a money loser year after year. And so in the fallout of this investigation, the NCAA got in a lot of trouble. Things began to change. The women's tournament was finally granted to use the name rights of March Madness, which before this had only been afforded to the men's tournament. They also had to have increased media outlets covering their sports, their tournaments, which inevitably caused fandom called the Caitlin Clark effect. And so the Iowa Hawkeyes, now Indiana Fever Guard, has completely reshaped the college basketball landscape. During her tenure, the Hawkeyes sold tickets across the country. She and the team went viral. Every time that they stopped to sign autographs and performed at these various stadiums, swaths of kids would line up to see their favorite athlete, and she broke dozens of records at her tenure with Iowa State. She broke the all-time scoring record for college basketball for most three-pointers in a single season for men's and women's basketball. This was a record that was previously held by Steph Curry, who is now a point guard for the Golden State Warriors, and is widely considered to be one of the greatest shooter in this game of basketball. And again, for the first time in history, the viewership for the women's March Madness tournament crushed the viewership of the men's tournament. 18.7 million to a mere 14.8 million. Nearly 19 million people watched the Clark and the Hawkeyes take on the legendary coach Dawn Staley and the South Carolina Gamecocks during the championship game. But even though the Hawkeyes lost, it was the most watched college basketball game, men's, women's, college, or pro, in 5 years. And so a lot of sports sociologists look at this as a truly a direct result from the 2021 NCAA basketball disparity TikTok. But I like this quote from Michaela McKenzie that the Caitlin Clark effect, the unprecedented respect and excitement surrounding women's basketball, could not have happened if generations of women across sports hadn't been fighting for every inch of progress that got us to this moment. And that's what makes it feel different. This season of women's college basketball showed us what's possible, and now it's up to us to keep the momentum. And truly, I think after having witnessed this firsthand as a sports person, that not only do we see this popularity shine with women's basketball in the college space, but we also see this in the professional basketball space, professional hockey, professional unrivaled basketball. And so I want us to be reflective of this, that do you think that this is a permanent effect or just a temporary one? I also want us to be very mindful of this time as we're going forward in talking about mental health as well as body abuse. And we see that in various sports. And namely, I like to talk about this really issues surrounding the safety of athletes, namely talking about Damar Hamlin and Tua Tagovailoa. So if you can, when you have this PowerPoint in front of you, please click on these links so that you're able to watch these videos. But I really like talking about this because, again, we talk about issues of sports being inherently violent. But as more of a sociological commentary, why do we expect athletes to have self-sacrifice, right? We talked about this for many generations, that sports require these ideals of hyper-masculinity, self-sacrifice, putting your body on the line for sports goals. And so we still see this in many very vivid examples today. Damar Hamlin, safety for the Buffalo Bills, likely suffered commotio cordis, which basically is a cardiac arrest as a result of a sudden hit to the chest that caused a cardiac arrest that happened on Monday Night Football, January 2nd, 2023. In a game against the Cincinnati Bengals. We also have the example of Tua Tagovailoa, who suffered from various concussions throughout the 2022, 21, 23 season. And so a lot of reasons why this happened in succession was because the team doctor misdiagnosed his concussions. And so, as I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with TBI, if you have concussions repeatedly, it causes even more severe irreversible brain damage. And so it led to a lot of people actually pleading with Tua to retire, even though he was just starting out with his career. And so as you watch these videos, what are some of the things that you notice about their behaviors? How do they cope with the trauma that happened to them? And then why do athletes like Damar and Tua feel the need to push through the trauma? And is this right for us as spectators to expect these things and these behaviors from our heroes, our sporting heroes? And so kind of with that, acknowledging too that this is an era of really accepting mental health in the sporting space. That now more than ever are we in an era that discusses, destigmatizes, and prioritizes mental health in sports. And there's a lot of different examples that I've listed on this page, and I'm sure that you can all think of various examples of athletes in your respective sports that use their platform to talk about mental health. Just to give you some examples of athletes that I think are very prolific in this discussion, we have Michael Phelps, who is arguably one of the greatest athletes of all time. He's a swimmer. He's the most decorated Olympian. He has ADHD and intermittent depression, and with that depression had very adverse coping mechanisms. He abused alcohol, resulting in some DUIs. He even had thoughts of suicide after the 2012 Olympics, where he won 4 golds and 2 silver medals, really bringing about a conversation that, yes, even though these athletes are phenomenal performers in sport, they still suffer from the same ailments that non-athletes do. Another example is Simone Biles, who just very recently in the landscape of sports prioritized mental health over athletic performance, in which she experienced the twisties, which if any of us have been in the gymnastics space or even been to like a gymnastics or a trampoline type of, space, it's basically where you lose your kinesthetic awareness of where you are in space, which for gymnastics is extremely dangerous. And so it not only did it cause her to be fearful of performing in sport, but it caused her to feel depressed and anxious surrounding performance because, one, she could seriously hurt herself or kill herself on doing these routines that she had, again, for her entire life been very familiar with. But 2, because she wasn't able to perform, she felt like there was a loss of identity, that she, couldn't fulfill her expectations in the sport. And so that caused her to be extremely depressed. But, considering all these things, in 2021 Tokyo Olympics, she actually pulled out of competing at the Olympics. I want us to acknowledge too that yes, this was happening to her, but in the greater context of her life, just a month before the 2021 Tokyo Olympics, Simone Biles and other athletes that actually were at the Olympics had to go in front of a court and testify against the FBI's mishandling of the Larry Nassar case. She was one of the athletes that was sexually abused by Larry Nassar. And so she not only had to deal with reliving all of the trauma that she had experienced with him, but then she has to go in and try to perform at her ability when she couldn't even figure out where she was in space. And so she literally, she took a really courageous step and pulled herself out of competition. And I love this quote that she has that, I have to put my pride aside. I have to do what's right for me, focus on my mental health and not jeopardize my health and well-being. That's why I decided to take a step back. And I remember when this was happening, this wasn't that long ago. She was ripped apart to shreds for this. The idea that, again, athletes have gone soft, that they can't push through adversity. And it's I think that this is more of a critique on how people approach bravery in a space that really defies traditional expectations of sport. These ideas that, again, sports are supposed to be a space of reaffirming traditionalist values of self-sacrifice, of grit, of mental toughness, that you as an individual can't really have any personal strife against this because it's about a greater purpose. And so I really applaud Simone and her athletes for being brave enough to support her in this initiative, because again, it does take away from these really harmful traditional ailments of sport to really focus back on who makes the sport itself, who are the athletes. And we also have a time of, again, not just psychological abuse, but also body abuse. And so I like to talk about the enhanced games too, because again, as we reflect on the moral quandaries of sport, that sport should be a fair place, that doing PEDs is wrong because it gives you a concerted advantage over others. Now we find ourselves in a place where, well, knowing that we know about PEDs, knowing that it's really harmful for the body, but knowing that people know these things and still make an informed, educated decision to do it anyway, why not let them juice? And so here we have the creation of the enhanced games. And so feel free to go to their website just to kind of check it out. These are some of the screenshots from before they updated their website, which is kind of interesting that they updated it with different language as we're going towards when it's supposed to be happening. But the enhanced games is a planned international sports event where athletes will not be subjected to drug testing. That this is from their website. The idea that performance enhancements have always been an integral part of sports. Yet, the latter half of the 20th century has seen the latest breakthroughs in synthetic biology closeted and stigmatized. When used correctly, the inclusion of performance enhancements can have significantly positive effects on the result of training and exercise routines. Simply put, performance enhancements augment the effects of training and help athletes reach the true peak of their athletic ability. Rather than penalizing the widespread use of performance enhancements, the enhanced movement embraces enhanced athletes. We want to see what humans are truly capable of. And so before I go to the next couple slides, I want us to be kind of reflective of, should this be a thing? Do you believe that there should be an enhanced leagues for athletes? Would this diminish the interest in non-enhanced leagues? And would there be any societal consequences to this or moral consequences to this? Because again, as we've seen in the entire, themes of this class, sports aren't just sports. They're mediums to teach character. They're mediums to spread values. They're mediums to really establish moral grounds. And so when you have an entire group in kind of this countercurrent to just do away with these traditionalist elements, is this a good thing? And so these are some of the things that, again, were in the old edition of the website, which is interesting that this isn't available to us now. But this is kind of like tips for athletes who want to come out as enhanced. You don't have to come out as enhanced. Coming out can be a really positive experience. Don't worry about other people's reactions. Just as lions aren't concerned with the opinions of sheep, so should you not concern yourself with those who cite outdated moral arguments and incorrect science. If friends, family, or your coach react in a negative way, it's not necessarily it won't necessarily be how they always feel. Give them time to adjust. Allow people to be shocked. Stay in control of the news. And if you think you know someone who's enhanced, remember that you can't force them to come out. And so I really like this screenshot just because I think that it's very interesting and intentional that they used diction that is very similar to how queer athletes and queer people are thought of in their journeys as coming out, right? This idea that this is a very monumental moment for queer people when they decide to tell people that they're queer. Very similarly, that's how they're kind of phrasing this approach to being enhanced, that just in the same way that we can't discriminate people from their sexuality, we also shouldn't discriminate people on their choice to be enhanced. But that's the differentiating factor. That for queer people, that isn't a choice, who they like and who they want to spend the rest of their life with, sexually, romantically, or otherwise. Being enhanced is a choice, but I think that it is very intentional that they use this language to try to bridge that kind of social understanding of using this type of language geared towards folks that we can't discriminate against. And so they do so because they know that they're going to have a huge amount of pushback on these choices. And so they utilize this diction for the explicit purpose, for people to not discriminate against them, even though comparatively to sexual orientation, this is a choice. It's also a cool thing for us to, again, see their very, perceivably transparent way about going about it. But if you navigate that website, there's a lot that really we don't know about this initiative. But phase 1, baseline medical profiling and informed choice to dope. Phase 2 is where athletes are grouped into natural athletes, independently enhanced athletes, or enhanced team athletes. Phase 3 is continuous medical supervision, personalized performance and financial support. And phase 4 is the inaugural enhanced games. And so again, not only are they trying to legitimize themselves of anti-discrimination by using diction for queer people, but they're also trying to legitimize themselves by establishing enhanced world records. That there are some people, that some of the athletes that we've talked about, like Lance Armstrong, who were caught doping when they were not allowed to be doping in their sports, but have achieved certain accolades based on that choice to do performance-enhancing drugs. And so they're trying to legitimize themselves by saying that athletes have had these accolades before, even if they did so in a time and a space that they were not allowed to do these things with. And so I, again, think that this is a really interesting time too, that I want us to reflect on this, an idea in a world where we are so ingrained to think of the idea of sports of being a fair and moral and just place. We've seen many examples in which that's not true. And so the Enhanced Games basically says we're not going to lie to you all anymore. We're not going to have this facade that sports should be a moral, fair space, because it's really not. We've seen this with sexism. We've seen this with racism. We've seen this with socioeconomic discrimination. And so this is a really interesting space that I want you all to reflect on as we wrap up this class as, is this countercurrent acceptable? Is this counter community, do they have valid points in this? And so again, feel free to also watch this Instagram video too of an Olympian athlete who, again, trained, competed cleanly, now does performance enhancing drugs, and now is able to accomplish so much more, knowing that these things are harmful to the body, knowing that these things are going to have long-term implications, but he makes that choice anyway. Kind of another kind of thematic overarch to this too is, what responsibility do we have as a society to protect people from these choices? Is it our choice to force onto others what they can and cannot do with their bodies? And so again, it is kind of, it's less about, yes, the Enhanced Games as an entity, but more so about the implications behind what this really means. So I want you to explore. I want you to really reflect on this as again, you've seen the history of our American sport as what it is, the pitfalls, the plot holes, the hypocrisy, and so many things. Is this kind of a solution? Is let people do what they want? So just reflect on this, and we'll continue on from there. It's kind of a secondary example of this idea of liberty and personal freedoms is with COVID-19. COVID-19, as it happened in spring of 2020, nearly caused all sports to postpone or cancel their seasons, which again, if any of you are interested in looking about what people really did spend their time on, marble racing on YouTube became extremely popular as a result of COVID-19. People were extremely desperate for a sense of normalcy within sport because, again, as we've seen, a lot of our cultural climate is really kind of functions on not only the structure, but also the expectation that sport is always going to be there. And so because COVID-19 forced sports to shut down, people didn't want to get cross-contamination, they didn't want any outbreaks. People were desperate for the sense of sports normalcy. And so marble racing became very popular online, so feel free to check that out. But it's also important to recognize too, as we go through each of these examples, recognize when sports started to come back. Did they have any restrictions on competitions? And did the athletes that played these sports contract COVID-19 or not during these reintroductions of sports? The MLB was the first to start. They began again in July 23rd, 2020. They did not have a bubble, but they did have geographical restrictions in which we started to see a lot more competition between local teams so that they didn't have cross-nation or even international competitions, causing outbreaks for the teams that would play against each other. But because they didn't have a bubble system, many athletes would actually have contractions. Many teams would have full-out breakouts. And so that was something that the MLB had to navigate because they were just starting their season. The WNBA was finishing up their season, but needless to say, they started the next day, July 24th. They had a bubble system at IMG Academy, which basically a bubble is they were limiting the amount of people to enter or leave the WNBA competition space. And so IMG Academy is a athletic preparatory school in Florida. And some of the things that kind of came about with the WNBA is that if they had a medical condition, they could opt out of that season, but they would not receive pay. And so a lot of WNBA athletes talked about how they didn't feel like they had a choice, even if they didn't feel safe competing. But that being said, they didn't have any cases of COVID-19 contraction. The bubble was extremely efficient, which they were able to still have 22 games without any fans spectating. The WNBA was the next to start on July 30th. They had a bubble system at ESPN Worldwide Sports Complex in Florida. This was the kind of the Disney bubble is what a lot of people kind of remember it as because it was at Disney World. And what they did is that they basically invited the 22 teams that were within 6 games of making playoffs. They were invited to the bubble, and then they would, whenever they would play games, they would be eliminated, and then they would go back to, do off-season training, off-season rest, whatever. Because of their bubble system, they had no cases of contraction, and they had 172 games without fans spectating them. For the NHL, this was an interesting one because, again, as we reflected, the NHL is a national hockey league. It's mostly American. 25 of the 32 teams are in the United States, and 7 of them are in Canada. And so because America and Canada kind of approached COVID-19 very differently. I think that it was very politically motivated how people went about doing vaccines or like personal protections. Canada, as an institution or as a government, did not want Americans to be coming and going because they didn't believe that Americans were taking the pandemic seriously enough. And so what happened is that they started on August 1st, and basically they had 2 city bubble systems in Canada. One for the Western Conference in Toronto, and the other one in Edmonton, Toronto in the east and then Edmonton in the west, both in Canada. They had very efficient bubble systems. They had absolutely no cases of contraction, in which the top 12 teams from the 2 conferences had their own hub cities for playoffs in Canada. Like I said, Canadian officials wouldn't let Canadians travel to the US or vice versa, so everyone had to go up to Canada in order to play. They had 71 games without fans. The NFL was kind of an interesting example because they were able to still relatively start on time comparatively to the other sports that were forced to postpone their seasons. And so they didn't have a bubble system, and they also didn't delay their regular season start, and they had very minimal changes. They did cancel their preseason, which unfortunately led to a lot of injuries happening during the regular season. But they had they had regular seasons. They had flexibility in bye weeks because some teams would have entire COVID breakouts. And with that, they had many outbreaks among athletes and staffs, which caused a lot of delays and barred a lot of athletes from playing. But they did have an entire full regular season of 256 games, but local regulation really determined their fan spectatorship, which is, again, very highly politically motivated. Local states decide how seriously they wanted to apprise the COVID-19 situation. And we see that very vividly with our vaccine mandates, in which currently, even today, there are no professional sports teams or organizations that are requiring athletes to be vaccinated. However, the stickiness is what happens when local governments require vaccine mandates to access indoor spaces. And so this caused a lot of strife. Because players' unions fought for athletes' choice to get vaccinated or not, compared to many coaches and athletic staff that were required to be vaccinated. So there was a lot of kind of hypocrisy there. But vaccinated athletes had far fewer restrictions compared to non-vaccinated athletes, right? And so because athletes recognize that if you were vaccinated, you didn't have to go through all the hoops, make all these concessions, wearing masks indoors, getting tested all the time, a lot of athletes unfortunately decided to engage in very devious behavior, in which Kyrie Irving, just as an example, at the time was a Brooklyn Nets point guard. He was unable to practice or play with the Nets because he was not vaccinated. That was a requirement by the city of New York that required folks entering indoor spaces to have at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. He missed out on millions of dollars for the missed games and practices that he did because he didn't want to get vaccinated. You also have Andrew Wiggins, who at the time, again, was a Golden State Warriors forward, requested a religious exemption from San Francisco's vaccine mandate, but the NBA denied the request. Wiggins also received the vaccine after his exemption was denied, and then has been able to play with the rest of the regular season. Aaron Rodgers, who at the time was the Green Bay Packers quarterback, he is now with the Pittsburgh Steelers, faced very harsh criticisms after it was revealed that he was not vaccinated against COVID-19 after he had previously told reporters that he had been immunized. And so that brought a much greater discussion of what was the difference between immunization versus vaccines. And people kind of had this misconception about what vaccines were and how that could influence one's ability to be truly protected from COVID-19 and protect others. And so a lot of people really highlighted Rodgers' apparent failure to follow the NFL protocols for unvaccinated players, like wearing a face mask while indoors. You also have Antonio Brown, which at the time he was a Tampa Bay Buccaneer wide receiver. He was suspended for 3 games, very similarly for misrepresenting his vaccine status, where he actually obtained a fake COVID-19 vaccine card over the summer. Since then, he's gotten vaccinated. But then we also have Evander Kane, who at the time was the San Jose Sharks forward. He was suspended for 21 games with no pay for submitting a fake vax card to the league. And so all this to say that, again, it really kind of comes down to this idea of personal responsibility, personal agency, and how people make choices based on these perceptions of health and safety for others. With that, we also have to acknowledge that the BLM movement that happened during this decade was extremely transformational within the sporting space. But this didn't start in 2020, where most of us really kind of approached BLM. Colin Kaepernick has really kind of been the face of this movement all the way from 2016, when he began kneeling during the national anthem to protest racial injustice, police brutality, and systemic racism. People at the time supported him, but other people also vilified him. So much so that Trump at the time thought he ought to be fired from his starting quarterback position, in which he was. In 2020, you start to see a resurgence, which again, I think that the combination of COVID-19, people not being able to go to work, people not being able to pursue other leisurely efforts, forced people to be online all the time. And so people were able to see these very vivid demonstrations and blatant police murders of folks of color, particularly George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, but other examples as well. And so that spurred a huge outrage for people really, again, protesting systemic injustice, systemic racism, and injustices following suit. So that really allowed people to have a greater conversation because people were witnesses to it and they had nothing really else to do. And so that was a way for people to have a lot more support for the movement. And again, we're going to talk about whether or not that was genuine or not. but it was nonetheless very powerful. So powerful that most major sporting organizations throughout the world showed their support for BLM, which, as we reflect on this class, very rarely do sports organizations actually support anything that disagrees with the status quo, which again, BLM very much disagreed with the status quo that there was racism that still existed in the United States. And so as kind of a reflection on that, media typically, again, wants to reach the widest net of customers, so they avoid using and promoting controversial content, which a lot of people perceived BLM as very controversial, right, against the status quo. And so they had a choice to make, that these media companies could either not cover sports and lose their easiest money makers because people are always going to watch sports, or they could acknowledge that people are going to stop putting money towards this broadcasting network and stop following because they're posting controversial content. But that's what they did. And so that is why we started to see this systemic support for not only the sports organizations, but the media companies covering that sports organization as well. The NFL, NBA, and tennis are just a couple of examples, but if you did want to see more variety in the different sports and how they approach BLM, feel free to click on the CNN article hyperlink there. But the NFL was kind of one of the biggest organizations to really capitalize off of BLM, in which they had a lot of systemic support that unfortunately was met with some backlash. And some of the things that they did, they had End Racism. It takes all of us kind of adorned on end zones. They played the Black National Anthem, which is something they still do today. Teams gathered on the field to lock arms in moments of unity before games. And depending on the fan base and home state, some fans rejoiced for this systemic support, but others would boycott and even boo when they would happen during the games. And like I said, the 2020 season started regularly, and I believe it was the Kansas City Chiefs and the Houston Texans, but pretty red fan bases, right? Pretty conservative fan bases. And so when they had all these demonstrations and they had this systemic support very vividly on the field, you could hear, I mean, I wasn't there, but you could hear even on the TV, just the crowds of boos, people just so abhorrent to this type of support that that racism doesn't exist and that it's very politically motivated. So again, the NFL, for all it did, still was met with a lot of backlash. The NBA also had much more support, systemic support, and they even boycott games for the movement. That again, Black Lives Matter has been prominently displayed on the courts. Players have been supporting social justice messages on the backs of their jerseys for decades at this point. But Milwaukee Bucks also made headlines on August 23rd, 2020, when they boycott a playoff game in response to the police shooting of Jacob Blake, which happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, only about 40 miles from Milwaukee. The NBA went on to postpone all 3 of its playoff games that day, and other leagues like the WNBA, MLB, MLS, and NHL also boycott games to bring light and awareness to police brutality against folks of color. We also have, for tennis, Naomi Osaka, when she was playing the US Open in 2021, wore face masks with different victims of police brutality in all 7 of her matches. So it's, again, utilizing your platform to bring about awareness, but also change. But I also want us to be very mindful of this systemic approach. We have to be very critical because, again, acknowledging that historically, systems don't want to change the status quo, especially in sport. And so when you have organizational support for something that is relatively contentious that goes against the status quo, we need to be mindful about why this shift happens. And I do want to acknowledge that many athletes and leaders do believe in the BLM movement, right? We've seen athletes utilize their platform to talk about this. We've seen systemic support. The NFL has actually made a lot of concerted efforts to programs like Inspire Change, which is really kind of putting money towards developing better relationships between police, their community, criminal justice reform, education, and economic advancement. But it's also important for us to recognize that there are a lot of organizations that might capitalize off of these trends because it's trendy or expected, that they don't actually believe in it, but it's expected for them to have some sort of systemic support. And there's a lot of performative actions and examples that have illuminated itself to really expose this inauthenticity. One of the examples of this is Colin Kaepernick and Roger Goodell, in which NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell spoke out that we, the National Football League, admit that we were wrong for not listening to NFL players. Colin Kaepernick, earlier and encourage all to speak out and peacefully protest. We, the National Football League, believe Black Lives Matter, which maybe would have been a change of heart. But also I felt like he more likely felt the social and financial pressure to support BLM in the wake of Colin Kaepernick doing this years before this was kind of expected for these major organizations to support. We also have the Washington Commanders that from BLM, sponsors took anti-racism very seriously and began to pull merchandise of the Washington football team, which at the time was the Washington R-word team, like Nike, literally pulling the team's merchandise from its website because they're not changing their name. It is a racial slur. And so the team was losing money and consequently rebranded itself to the Washington football team. That financial pressures, not genuine support for the anti-racism movement in sport, caused the name change. Another example of this is leadership in the NBA and WNBA, and you can make the argument with the NFL as well, that we do not have true leadership representation for folks in power in these sports, and in particular for the NBA, a league that's 72% Black, only 50% of its head coaches are Black. For the WNBA, at the time, only 2 head coaches were Black, and the league is 80% Black, so we just don't have that representation there. And another example that is particularly pertinent that a lot of people forget about just because his name isn't in the headlines anymore is Jon Gruden. That on October 11th, 2021, he stepped down as the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders, hours after the New York Times detailed emails in which he had made homophobic and misogynistic remarks. However, an earlier report of racist statements about about the president of the NFL Players Association, their union, was made a week previous. And so even though the NFL knew that he was having these racist exchanges with people, particularly someone who's in a very powerful position in the NFL, there was no disciplinary action that was done about those racist comments. Only after homophobic and misogynistic remarks did he step down. But now he is suing the NFL because he perceives himself to be a scapegoat for other instances of nefarious, sexist, homophobic remarks that happen in other spaces, that he was just kind of the one who got caught. And so all of this to say, I want us to be very aware of when we have systemic support for these movements that go against the status quo. Why are these things happening? Why do we see a shift? Is it actually to support the movement, or is it really just to financially capitalize on other people and fans that expect these things to be normalized? And so with that, we see that the emergence of new sports media is changing how people engage with sports today. The internet has been transformational on how people absorb sports information, in which we now see that there is actually a large concentration of people who are considered to be broadband-only homes in which they don't have cable to absorb their sports content. That most people in the United States have some sort of social media presence, they're online, and so a lot of organizations really capitalize on that. They have social media brands, they have websites, apps, on-demand streaming, YouTube channels, fantasy leagues, and social media. And so reflect on how you get your sports media and be mindful of how you get that media and if there are unintentional maybe influences or ideologies that are perpetuated through this media lens. Social media being one of those lenses that most people use their smartphones for social media. And I want us to be very mindful and maybe self-reflective as well, that has this increased fandom and connectivity, or has this caused the bad side of fandom to emerge to the forefront? And again, it's not to say that the things I'm going to talk about now are new to the sporting space, but we see it in a new lens. The idea that a lot of athletes are using social media for a lot of different reasons, but they unfortunately face a lot of different ramifications of that. One is that for a lot of athletes, they're encouraged or dissuaded from engaging in social media before big events. And a lot of the reason why is because people are very outspoken now, and they feel like on social media that allows them to have better parity with athletes to express their discontent. Anything from fantasy performance to their records, to them just being a person of color, to them just being a woman, allows people to feel like they have the agency or the power to be able to say these things, these hateful comments towards athletes. And so restrictions are in place, but a lot of athletes also recognize that this also allows them to have increased autonomy, that they no longer have to succumb to what some other sports writer says about them, that they can actually create their own narrative. So there are pros and cons to social media. There's pros and cons to using the internet as a modality for sports. But it's also important for us to recognize that sports and how we engage in sports also are shifting as well. That esports are becoming much more popularized within the main sporting space. So esports are sports video games that have gained a lot of popularity and do contribute to sports spectatorship through various different mediums, right? Last week we talked about motion sensitive video games, but more often esports really kind of exist in the traditional video game medium. The idea of you using a controller with an associated console, whether that's PC, Xbox, PlayStation, what have you, in which a lot of tournaments have different athletes and teams that face off in these games that are popular with in-home gamers as well. Anything from the Call of Duty pot or Call of Duty to Fortnite to League of Legends to Counter-Strike to Overwatch, Madden, FIFA, pretty much any and every video game that's available, there are tournaments and money to be had. And so when you reflect on if esports are actually esports, really consider what makes a sport. And by definition, the one that I really like to use is this institutionalized competitive activity that involves physical skill, specialized facilities or equipment, and is conducted according to an accepted set of rules in order to determine a winner. The idea that it's institutionalized, it's competitive, it's physical, and it's specialized. And so when you also consider too, the money surrounding esports also very similarly reflects the money and power reflected in traditional sports. That esports reached a $1.4 billion value in 2022, and that is continuing to steadily grow. We see this with the purse, in which you can win millions of dollars by winning these tournaments. The Call of Duty purse all the way back then was $6 million. We also have endorsements of the athletes and their teams by these traditionally sport-like organizations like Red Bull endorsing Ninja or Nike endorsing Cloud9. And so with these investments, we also have traditional athletes endorsing these esport teams as well, like Steph Curry, Michael Jordan, and Drake, just to name some celebrities and other, highly prolific popular names, also give money to developing the esport culture. And so I want us to also reflect on if there are any benefits to esports. Do they develop the same characteristics and accolades as traditional sports? We also find that we're in an era in which we're normalizing sports betting again. And again, sports betting isn't new. We've seen this all the way from the 1700s, but we are seeing it grow in different spaces, namely online sports betting. That the growth of sports betting will be within apps managed in states where sports betting is legalized, in which I want us to be mindful, California is not one of those states. So you have to go and engage in sports betting in other states and other modalities. So like if you do DraftKings, that's in Massachusetts. If you do Barstool Sports, that's in New York. If you do FanDuel, that's also in New York. And so you're giving money to those local state economies that will never impact California directly. However, you can make the arguments that because the NFL is kind of like okay with sports betting, with the commercials and the endorsements that they have for these various sporting betting apps, that they're implicitly benefiting from it. But is all this to say that that's also kind of where we see our sports betting culture shift. There's also various types of sports bettors. We have casual sports bettors who usually bet among friends and peers, more so for the social aspect, with minimal effort towards strategy. It's more just so you get to spend time with your friends. On the other side, you have active sports bettors who look at wagers as investments. They use very versed strategy, and they put in a lot of immense effort into energy into their data and their bets. Typically, we find that for folks who do sports betting, they're usually mostly male between the ages of 18 and 34, full-time employees, and make above average income. The most common sports that people bet on are NFL, MLB, NBA, NCAA football, NCAA basketball, NHL, UFC, and esports. And right now, we just so happen to find ourselves in a space where we are experiencing an NBA gambling scandal again, in which the FBI has actually arrested not only the head coach of the Portland Trailblazers, but also various athletes in the sports, leaking information that's not publicly available to gambling sites in order to have skewed bets and their respective lines. And so that's something that's kind of unfolding now, but I did want to show you all that this is still very contentious in the sporting space. And a lot of people are even speculating that it's not just the NBA, but also the MLB, NFL, and NHL that are doing a lot of insider trading with gambling apps and gambling companies. We also have fantasy sports, which is just another way to engage with gambling. where you're able to choose athletes from different teams, and performance is usually determined by points. It's not necessary to buy in and gamble with fantasy, although most people have some sort of financial incentives to put in effort. Very similarly to the demographics of sports betting, folks who do fantasy sports are mostly male between the ages of 18 and 34, full-time employees, and make above average income, in which the most popular sports to do fantasy leagues are the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL, soccer, golf, esports, and even the Bachelor or Bachelorette shows. But I do kind of want to really focus and kind of extrapolate on this idea that there is still so much money moving around in the sporting space. And so, like I said last week, we are going to continue our discussion on NIL deals and really how it's transformed into what it was when we reconfigured the NC2A FBS divisions into what it is today. Acknowledging that there are maybe modern solutions to these modern problems, that in 2021, that changed everything for the collegiate sports space in the form of NIL deals and non-restricted use of the transfer portal. And I want to talk about these two things kind of synonymously, but the first that I'm going to talk about are NIL. So this is name, image, and likeness deals, basically where athletes are able to get money from their name, right? So like the names on the backs of jerseys that you have being sold in student stores. They're able to get money from their image, right? Their faces on posters, as well as their likeness, maybe like a silhouette of a instance in their various sports. And so the NC2A approved NIL deals on June 30th, 2021. However, there are many differences in how different states and conferences allow NIL deals for their athletes. New Mexico is pretty liberal in allowing their student athletes to make as much money as they reasonably want or can. Comparatively to Mississippi, they are very restrictive on the amount of money that they allow their athletes to bring in. So again, it depends not only on the local community, the local state, but it also depends on where you play and who you play for. Typically, we find that athletes that take advantage of very lucrative deals of NIL deals usually go to very dominant sports programs, very recognizable institutions. And just to name a couple of examples, Bryce Young really kind of came into the light. Yes, he was a very good quarterback at the University of Alabama, but he took advantage of NIL deals while he was a student athlete. You also have Livy Dunn, who, if any of you are in the TikTok space, know of her as, yes, a gymnast at LSU, but also as a brand ambassador for various brands like Viore, among other things. We also have Caleb Williams, who is pictured here. He wanted to take advantage of the NIL deal so much that he actually transferred from the Oklahoma Sooners to USC to capitalize on LA being a very, lucrative, there's a lot of money to be had in Southern California. And recognizing that USC is a very, very historically dominant football program. And so he signed with so many different brands as soon as he transferred to USC. And so, like I said, college athletes are now being allowed to receive financial compensation by profiting off of their personal brand. They monetize their name and image for profit. And this can be anything from signing sponsorship deals from corporate brand companies, creating one's logo or brand merchandise for profit, as well as being able to charge for things like pictures, cameo videos, and even autographs. And so, like I said, I think that there are a lot of conversations around NIL, and really this is kind of the Wild West of commercialization for college sports because we've never seen anything like this before. And so every other day, I feel like I get an ESPN notification talking about how the interpretations of NIL deals are always evolving. But I also want us to be mindful of the pros and cons of this new system. So the pros of NIL deal is what it is today. Student athletes now rightfully hold an increasing level of power in their own agency and brand, something that we've never seen before, in which athletes have always kind of had to succumb to the pressures and influence of coaches, of brands, of organizations of sports. Now they can fight for themselves. They also have more financial help for family and friends via upward social mobility, which again, as we talked about, the ability to go pro is so extremely rare that for so many athletes that put in decades of their life to devote themselves to sport, very rarely do they actually ever see any financial reward from that devotion. This allows them to at least have some financial compensation while they're able to still utilize that platform. A lot of athletes use this or a lot of schools use this as a recruiting tool for high-profile universities. And we also see that for gender differences, football excluded women athletes make up majority of NIL deals. However, there are a lot of cons to this system as well, that usually only those who are the best or go to high-profile universities benefit, while smaller universities actually suffer as the direct result of a lot of large institutions siphoning money off away from these opportunities that could have been more equitized for smaller brands. There's a shift more from academics to athletics. The idea that scholarship should be enough is just no longer true. It doesn't really fix the fundamental issues of college athletics overall. There's also been a mental health decline due to the oversaturation of media and commercialization for college athletics. And again, gender differences can be beneficial, but really acknowledging that football, as a predominantly male sport, makes up 51.1% of all NIL deals. Women's sports receive 27.4%, and all other men's sports receive 27 or 21.5%. And with that, there's little to no regulations or laws. So anything can really happen during this time. We're seeing athletes actually forego their professional careers because they can make more money as college athletes with NIL. And so all of this to say that the NIL deals that we see today wouldn't have been as powerful if it wasn't for the reconstruction and evolution of the transfer portal that also happened to happen in 2021. The transfer portal was created in 2018 basically to ease the burden of the college transfer process. Like, people want to move around to different institutions, so the transfer portal was created as a way for that ease and transfer to happen better. But in 2021, that shifted because before then, if you were able to transfer schools, you were really only allowed to transfer one time. And if you were a student athlete that transferred schools, you had to take a gap year to basically kind of act as a punishment or a deterrent from switching universities that you initially signed to. That changed in 2021, that allow all college athletes to be able to transfer schools, including football and basketball, and allow these athletes to transfer once without needing to sit out for that one season, which used to be the requirement. And so I have an example of Tez Walker, who was an athlete who kind of, took advantage of this system during COVID-19. Feel free to read up about that there. But it's also important to recognize how the transfer portal works. That in order to enter the transfer portal, athletes have to notify the school of their intent to transfer during their portal window, usually after or in the middle of a season if something were to happen. Like, as an example of this, a portal window again, usually happens when the season's over, but as an example that I can think of off the top of my head, UCLA, we fired our head coach, our OC, and our DC mid-season. That allowed a transfer portal to open, a transfer window to open for UCLA athletes as part of the football program. And so typically this window happens after the season's over, but in specific instances where that happens, athletes are allowed to transfer if they choose to. That being said, from there, when the window is open, the school's compliance department has 48 hours to put the athlete's name into the portal, which we're going to see in a second what that portal looks like for other coaches to be able to see athletes that want to leave. And because of the increased commercialization of NIL deals, that incentivizes on-field success, really spurring increased recruitment efforts and retaining the best athletes. And so these incentives can come at the cost of adhering to the NC2A's restrictions. So much so that we see these, not only the portal itself, but we see third-party tracking tools that not only have access to the transfer portal, but also rank these athletes based on, what position they played, what school they played for before, and delineates these athletes into stars. So not only are these athletes just based on name, based on where they went, but they're also delineated to a ranking system. And so we see the pros of this as, yes, this is a streamlined system for the transfer process, right? It allows athletes to have a lot more agency over their college experiences and NIL deals potentially. But it's also extremely volatile. There's little to no regulation of who gets to transfer where. They also break a lot of NC2A ethics code violations because you can kind of incentivize athletes to put themselves into the transfer portal by guaranteeing them that they're going to get money upon their acceptance into another university. This is, like I said, they're poaching athletes, they're tampering with NIL boosters, which aren't really a thing anymore. Because now athletes are able to be considered employees of the university in which they play sports for. So that's kind of done away with. But it's very similar to free agency. So it's this idea that, again, for NC2A college sports to be thought of as an amateur space is just a complete lie at this point. It's a lie that we've told ourselves for decades before, but now seeing this as a very commercialized, professional-like space, college athletes are now professional athletes, and we see this very vividly with the NIL deals and with the transfer portal. Additionally, we are commodifying people. We are delineating an entire complex individual to a ranking, to a number, and we see this just create a huge dissonance that a lot of fans, coaches, and people around the sporting space have towards the athletes. They feel compelled, like I said, on social media to have hate speech, to have slurs thrown at them. Because people often kind of maybe make this, again, this dissonance, but also this lack of human empathy towards these athletes because of this system. And so, like I said, this is a screenshot of what the transfer portal actually really looks like. So you can see here, the athlete name, the sport they played for, the university, the conference, as well as their division, right? So all these things to say that, again, sports are moving in a very interesting direction. I think that we are very privileged in the sense that we're able to witness so much change as it's happening now. But things that I want us to remember from this very long lecture video are the various Olympics, kind of differences and notable events that happen at the various Olympics that I expressed. Misconduct events and important details between Operation Varsity Blues, the cheating Houston Astros, Larry Nassar, and USA Gymnastics. The fight for gender equality with U.S. women's national team, the WNBA, NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, March Madness disparity leading to the Caitlin Clark effect, various sporting crises like increased violence and body trauma, as well as the enhanced games. COVID-19 vaccine mandate, so how and when people return to sport, if they had a bubble or not, confirmed cases, fans or not, as well as their date to return, as well as noting athletes with devious behaviors in response to the COVID-19 vaccines. Also, the BLM movement and its effects on sports media organizations and the athletes, but also consider the performative actions done as a result of the BLM movement by these sport institutions, acknowledging new media and global sports changing. How people engage with sports media is very much more focused on the internet and social media. Esports also gaining a lot of popularity and kind of notoriety. Sports betting and fantasy, so know the difference between active and casual bettors, demographics of folks who do sports betting and fantasy sports, as well as the ease of access and the types of sports most commonly bet on. And then finally, our final conversation around NIL and the transfer portal, understand how they both kind of rely on one another for their successes and the general pros and cons of both of these systems. And so as we finish up by reflecting on our time together, please do take the time to do your lecture evaluations. I know it's challenging with an online class, but your honesty does help me become a better instructor, especially in a modality that isn't my preferred. I do love seeing students face to face. I do want to make this as an enriching experience as I possibly can with the modality of it being an asynchronous lecture. So please let me know what I'm doing right, what I need to improve on, and please take times to be able to do that. Like I said, this is our last week together, so make sure that you have your quiz done. Your paper 3 will be due soon, and then next week will be your final, which is basically covering everything after the midterm. So from 1900 to 2025, you have the entire week to do it. Please know the firsts and people of importance of each era listed in our review. Additionally, your PowerPoint presentation is due in the middle of the month. Please let me know if you have any questions about this. I really hope you enjoyed our time together. This is one of my favorite classes that I teach, just because I think it's very unique. And so again, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or would just like to further chat about things we learned in our time in American sports together. Have a lovely end of your semester, and I hope to see you all in person in the future. All right, bye.